Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a story many of us think we know, but it's far more complex and fascinating than what we learned in school. We're talking about the true history of the United States of America, from its earliest inhabitants to its rise as a global superpower. So, grab your popcorn, because this is going to be an epic journey. Let's rewind the clock, way back before the idea of America even existed. For thousands of years, the vast continents we now call North and South America were home to millions of people. These weren't just scattered tribes. They were vibrant, complex societies. From the massive city of Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, with its earthen mounds rivaling the pyramids of Egypt, to the intricate cliff dwellings of the ancestral Pueblones in the southwest, and the powerful Iroquois Confederacy in the northeast, this land was a mosaic of cultures, languages, and innovations. They developed sophisticated agriculture, built extensive trade networks that crisscrossed the continent, and created rich spiritual and political systems. This was the world that existed long before the first European ships appeared on the horizon. Everything changed in 1492. Christopher Columbus, looking for a new route to Asia, landed in the Bahamas, kicking off what's known as the Columbian Exchange. This wasn't just an exchange of goods. It was a collision of worlds. Europeans brought horses, guns, and steel, but they also brought diseases like smallpox and measles, which indigenous populations had no immunity to. The result was catastrophic, leading to a demographic collapse on a scale rarely seen in human history. This great dying depopulated vast areas, making European colonization easier. It's a tragic and foundational part of the American story that is often overlooked. European powers, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England rushed to claim their piece of this new world, driven by a hunger for gold, God, and glory. Now, let's zoom in on the English colonies, which would eventually become the United States. The first permanent English settlement was Jamestown, founded in 1607. These early years were brutal, marked by starvation, disease, and conflict with the local Powhatan Confederacy. A little further north, the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth in 1620, seeking religious freedom. Over the next century and a half, 13 distinct colonies developed along the Atlantic coast. They were incredibly diverse. New England was shaped by Puritan values and a focus on trade and small farms. The middle colonies, like Pennsylvania and New York, were melting pots of different ethnicities and religions. The southern colonies, meanwhile, built their economies on large plantations growing cash crops like tobacco and cotton. And this brings us to a dark and central pillar of American history: slavery. The first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia in 1619, and over time, a system of chattel slavery became entrenched, particularly in the South. This brutal institution, built on the forced labor of millions, created immense wealth for the colonies and would cast a long shadow over the nation's future. By the mid-1700s, the colonists were developing a unique identity. They were British subjects, yes, but they were also something new. They were Americans. They were separated from Britain by a vast ocean and had developed their own local governments and economies. Tensions began to simmer. After the costly French and Indian War, Britain decided the colonies should help pay for their own defense. They imposed a series of taxes, like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, without giving the colonists any representation in Parliament. The cry of "no taxation without representation" echoed through the streets. Events like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party pushed the colonies closer to the edge. Finally, in 1775, the shot heard round the world was fired at Lexington and Concord, and the American Revolutionary War began. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, a radical document declaring that all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights. It was a bold and audacious claim, especially coming from a society that held hundreds of thousands in bondage. Winning the war was one thing. Building a nation was another. The first attempt at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was too weak. The central government couldn't collect taxes or raise an army effectively. It was clear a change was needed. So, in 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. It was a document of brilliant compromises, establishing a federal system with a separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It created a framework for a republic that has endured for over 2 centuries. However, the compromise over slavery counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation without granting them rights was a moral failing that would eventually tear the nation apart. With George Washington as the first president, the grand American experiment officially began. The 19th century was a period of explosive growth and profound conflict. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the continent, took hold. Through treaties, purchases like the Louisiana Purchase from France, and wars like the Mexican-American War, the country stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This expansion came at a terrible cost to Native American nations, who were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands in brutal events like the Trail of Tears. As the nation grew, so did the tension between the industrializing, free labor North and the agrarian, slave-holding South. The question of whether new territories would permit slavery became the defining political battle of the era. Compromises were made, but they only delayed the inevitable. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president on an anti-slavery platform, and Southern states began to secede, forming the Confederacy. The Civil War that followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history. It was a war to preserve the Union, but it evolved into a war to end slavery. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the Union's eventual victory in 1865 finally abolished the institution. The period that followed, known as Reconstruction, was a brief, hopeful moment where formerly enslaved people gained citizenship and the right to vote. But this progress was met with violent resistance, and by the late 1870s, Reconstruction had failed. A new system of racial segregation and oppression, known as Jim Crow, would take hold in the South for nearly a century. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw America transform into an industrial powerhouse. This was the Gilded Age, a time of incredible wealth for industrialists like Carnegie and Rockefeller, but also a time of harsh working conditions and poverty for millions of workers, many of them new immigrants from Europe and Asia. Cities exploded in size, and innovations like the railroad, electricity, and the telephone connected the country like never before. This era also marked America's emergence onto the world stage. The Spanish-American War in 1898 left the U.S. with an overseas empire, controlling territories like the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. The country was no longer an isolated republic. It was becoming a global power. The 20th century tested the United States in unprecedented ways. It was pulled into 2 devastating world wars. World War I established America as a major military and economic player, but it was World War II that cemented its status as a superpower. The war effort lifted the country out of the Great Depression and left the U.S. with the world's strongest economy and military. The post-war era kicked off the Cold War, a decades-long ideological struggle against the Soviet Union. This period also saw immense social change at home. The civil rights movement led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr. fought to dismantle Jim Crow and achieve true equality for African Americans, leading to landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Other movements for women's rights, gay rights, and environmental protection also reshaped American society. From the end of the Cold War to the challenges of the 21st century, like the September 11th attacks and the 2008 financial crisis, the United States has continued to evolve. Its story is one of contradictions, a nation founded on the ideals of liberty and equality that was also built on slavery and conquest. It's a history of incredible innovation and progress, but also of deep-seated conflict and struggle. Understanding this complex and often difficult history is essential to understanding the United States today. The American experiment is not a finished product. It's an ongoing process, a continuous struggle to live up to its founding ideals. And that's a whirlwind tour of the formation of America. Of course, we've only scratched the surface, but hopefully, this gives you a more complete picture of this nation's incredible and complicated past. What part of this history do you find most fascinating? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into history. See you next time.